Somewhere in the classified archives of the Central Intelligence Agency, there exists an assessment of a paramilitary operation conducted in the central highlands of South Vietnam between 1963 and 1965. The document, portions of which have surfaced through subsequent historical research, describes the Truong Son force, a 1,200-man guerrilla army operating across Darlac province in the remote mountains along the Cambodian border, as having attained one of the best combat records in Vietnam by inflicting heavy casualties and equipment losses on the Viet Cong while sustaining minimum friendly losses. It is a dry sentence. It reads like every other CIA assessment of every other paramilitary operation in a decade full of them. What it does not convey, and what the document's authors may not have fully appreciated when they wrote it, is that the entire operation rested on the competence, judgment, and personal authority of a single 28-year-old Australian Army captain who was operating alone in the mountains, supplied by flights that landed on a dusty airstrip and departed before anyone could ask too many questions. In a war that Australia had not yet officially joined, his name was Barry Petersen. The Viet Cong placed a bounty on his head. The CIA eventually threatened to kill him. The highland tribes he led into battle named him after a legendary warrior no one had ever defeated. And by the time the Americans forced him out of the mountains in 1965, the territory he had held was so deeply associated with his presence that the enemy had learned to route around it entirely, choosing longer, more dangerous paths rather than pass through ground where something might come for them from the jungle and they would never see it coming. Before we go any further, I want you to think about something and tell me in the comments. Which do you think is the harder military problem, building a force that the enemy respects enough to fight, or building one they fear enough to avoid entirely? Because what Barry Petersen accomplished in the central highlands of Vietnam was the second thing. Not a force that fought well. A force that made the enemy decide the ground itself was not worth crossing. That distinction matters, and understanding how a single Australian captain achieved it is what this script is about. To understand why Petersen was the man the CIA sent into the highlands, and why the choice, once made, was so difficult to reverse, you need to understand what the Australian Army had been building for 20 years before he ever set foot in Vietnam. The foundation was not theory. It was mud and blood and the specific, costly education that comes from fighting in jungle terrain that does not forgive the soldier who misunderstands it. The foundation was New Guinea. The campaigns of 1942 and 43 along the Kokoda Track and at Milne Bay and Bunagona had demonstrated with brutal clarity that the soldier who could not inhabit jungle terrain not merely survive in it, but move through it with the quiet confidence of belonging, was not a soldier who could fight effectively in Southeast Asia. The Kokoda Track was not a position to be defended or a line to be held. It was a living environment that killed men who did not understand it as efficiently as the Japanese did, and which rewarded the soldiers who learned to read it with a tactical advantage no amount of firepower could fully replicate. The Australian soldiers who fought on that track came back knowing something that training manuals could approximate, but not fully capture: that the jungle itself was a participant in the battle, and that the army which enrolled it as an ally, rather than fighting it as an obstacle, would over time defeat the army that did not. The Kanangra Jungle Warfare Training Center in Queensland, established in November of 1942, in the immediate aftermath of those campaigns, was the institutional response to that lesson. It pushed tens of thousands of soldiers per year through terrain deliberately chosen for difficulty-steep ridgelines, dense secondary growth, creek crossings that married physical exhaustion to navigational complexity, and it was staffed not by curriculum administrators, but by veterans who had paid for their knowledge in the specific currency the jungle extracted, and who taught with the precision of people passing on things that had kept them alive. Kanungra was not a training center that simulated jungle warfare. It was one that produced soldiers for whom the jungle had become a professional environment rather than a hostile one. Soldiers who understood how sound traveled through dense vegetation and how it did not, who could read ground cover for observation and concealment simultaneously, who had internalized the lesson that slowness in jungle movement was not timidity, but the prerequisite for arriving at the objective without being detected. From Kanungra, the foundation deepened through the Malayan emergency. 12 years of counterinsurgency against the Malayan Races Liberation Army, from 1948 through 1960, transformed the Kanungra standard from excellent training into tested operational doctrine. The emergency produced something that training alone could not: a generation of Australian officers who had spent years learning that patience was not passive, that restraint was not timidity, and that the most effective weapon against a guerrilla force embedded in a civilian population was not firepower, but presence, the specific, credible, sustained presence of a force that understood the terrain and the people well enough to be trusted by one and feared by the other simultaneously. General Sir Harold Briggs's plan for the emergency, the Briggs Plan, implemented from 1950 onwards, separated the Chinese squatter population from the MNLA's supply network and denied the jungle to the insurgents through aggressive small unit patrol operations and the construction of protected new villages. It worked because it was sustainable indefinitely, and because it required exactly the kind of soldier the emergency had been producing. Someone who could operate for extended periods in hostile terrain, build relationships with local populations that the enemy could not replicate, and process intelligence from those relationships into operational decisions that arrived before the enemy expected them. What the emergency specifically taught, and the lesson that the Australian officers who served in it carried into Vietnam as professional instinct rather than borrowed theory, was the precise nature of the guerrilla's fundamental vulnerability. The guerrilla force that lives among the population draws everything it needs from that population: food, medicine, intelligence, recruits, safe houses, early warning of approaching security forces. This dependency is simultaneously the guerrilla's greatest operational strength and its only genuine weakness. As long as the population provides freely, the guerrilla is essentially invisible to any conventional force that cannot read the environment the population creates around him. The moment the population stops providing because it is protected from retaliation, or because it calculates that the cost of supporting the guerrilla now exceeds the cost of not supporting him, or because the counterinsurgency force has offered it a more credible guarantee of security than the guerrilla can, the guerrilla's invisibility collapses. He becomes a conventional force without a conventional force's resources, dependent on logistics he can no longer reliably access, and on intelligence networks that have stopped reporting. The British implemented this understanding through a combination of methods that the Australian battalions serving in the emergency absorbed by direct participation. The deep patrol operations that denied the MNLA freedom of movement in the jungle itself, the food denial programs that made sustained jungle survival difficult, and most critically, the patient intelligence work that turned population contact into targeting. This last element was what Petersen carried most completely into Vietnam. In Malaya, he had learned how information flowed from village populations into operational intelligence, when the soldiers collecting it had established the kind of trust that made honest reporting feel safe. when the person who told you where the guerrillas had been last night could be confident that doing so would not result in the guerrillas coming back to punish them. That trust had to be real, not performed. Populations with something at stake are not fooled by soldiers who are friendly during daylight hours and indifferent to their security after dark. The trust that the emergency's most effective units built was built through consistent, sustained, long-term presence, through being there before the problem arrived, not after it did. Barry Petersen had served in the Malayan emergency with the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, absorbing this culture not as a student of it, but as a practitioner within it. He came out of Malaya with the operational instincts the emergency produced in its best officers: patience as methodology, presence as weapon, relationship as intelligence infrastructure. When he was selected for the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, the AATTV, he was already exactly what the assignment required. The question was not whether he could do what was asked of him. It was whether the organization that sent him could manage what he was capable of doing. The AATTV itself was an expression of everything the Australian Army had concluded about what the Vietnam problem required. Colonel Francis Truong, who commanded the team from its establishment in 1962, had spent his career thinking about precisely this kind of war. He had been the commanding officer at Canungra. He had studied the Malayan emergency not as a historical curiosity, but as an operational manual with ongoing applicability. When United States Secretary of State Dean Rusk, at the ANZUS conference in Canberra in May of 1962, admitted with striking candor that the United States knew little about jungle warfare, Truong heard that admission as both a diagnosis and an operating space. The AATTV's philosophy was not to advise from behind a desk, but to place expert Australian soldiers within Vietnamese units at every level, living with them, operating alongside them, accountable to the same risks and the same outcomes. The team was not large. It was never intended to be large. Under our system, Truong said, we will do the lurking. It was not a boast. It was a precise description of an operational philosophy that the Australian Army had developed over 20 years and that Vietnam now gave them the opportunity to apply. Petersen arrived in Saigon in August of 1963 as a member of the AATTV. He was 28 years old, a captain, physically unremarkable in the way that capable men often are: short, stocky, quiet, possessed of the dry humor that characterizes Australian soldiers of that generation as reliably as any other trait. Nothing about his appearance announced what he was capable of. That was among the first things the raid noticed about him, and the first thing they understood correctly. A man who does not need to look dangerous has usually already decided that looking dangerous is a waste of energy better spent on being dangerous. Ban Mi Thuot, where Petersen was based, was the provincial capital of Darlak Province and the largest city in the Central Highlands, which is to say it was a small city by any standard, not calibrated to the specific remoteness of the Highland Plateau. The plateau itself sits at elevations of between 400 and 800 meters above sea level, rising in the east toward the Annamite Range that forms the spine of Vietnam, covered in alternating belts of dense jungle, open montane forest, and the coffee and rubber plantations that the French had established and that Vietnamese settlers had been expanding since independence. The climate was not the tropical heat of the coast, but a more temperate environment. Rain in the wet season that came in curtains and turned the red laterite tracks to mud, and a cooler dry season that was deceptive in its comfort because the jungle was still the jungle regardless of the temperature. To the west, the plateau dropped toward Cambodia along a border that existed on maps but had minimal presence on the ground. The Ho Chi Minh Trail moved through that border zone with the casual authority of something that had predated the boundary and would outlast it. Petersen's operational area in the highlands was vast by any measure that conventional military logistics could process, and essentially unprocessable by conventional military standards. He was, for most of his 2 years there, a single captain operating independently in a province the size of a small country, with a chain of command that was thousands of kilometers away in both directions. The Australian Army in Saigon and Canberra, the CIA in Langley, and with operational support that arrived on aircraft that did not officially land at airstrips that did not officially exist. The Air America flights that supplied him came in on the dust strip outside Bon Mi Thuat and departed, leaving no useful paperwork trail. This was not a hardship that Petersen experienced as a problem. It was the operational environment that the assignment created, and the assignment was one he had sought. A man who operates alone in the mountains with minimal oversight and maximal authority is either exactly the right man for the position or a catastrophe in preparation. Petersen was the former, which is precisely why the CIA eventually found him so difficult to manage. The CIA had been observing the AATTV since its arrival and had identified, in the team's Malayan emergency veterans, something that the American advisory effort in the highlands conspicuously lacked. Soldiers who had actually built relationships with indigenous populations in the context of active insurgency, who understood the difference between training a force and becoming part of it, and who were not carrying the accumulated institutional habits of an organization that had spent 2 decades solving most of its military problems through the application of material superiority. The CIA's program in the Central Highlands, recruiting and training Montagnard tribal fighters to defend their villages and disrupt communist supply lines through the mountains, had been running with results that the assessments described more favorably than the operational reality warranted. The Americans who ran it were competent professionals. They were not the right professionals for this specific problem, for reasons that had nothing to do with individual capability and everything to do with the structural constraints under which they operated. Rotations of 12 months that prevented the depth of relationship the highlands required, cultural frameworks that positioned the Montagnard as beneficiaries of American assistance, rather than as partners in a shared problem, and an institutional tendency to measure progress in outputs, numbers of men trained, weapons distributed, operations conducted, rather than in the more difficult to quantify metric of whether the population that the force was drawn from actually believed the program would protect them over time. That last question was the one that mattered most. Petersen went to the highlands to answer it. The Montagnard were the indigenous highland peoples of Vietnam's Central Highlands. 30-odd distinct tribal groups speaking different languages, bound by different customs and kinship systems, united primarily by centuries of exclusion at the hands of both the Vietnamese from north and south, communist and nationalist. They had all treated the highlands as territory to be settled and the Montagnard as a population to be assimilated or displaced, and the French, whose colonial administration had managed the highlands primarily as a resource to be taxed. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the communist logistical network running from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia and into the south that was the strategic spine of the entire insurgency, passed through Montagnard territory because that territory was the most direct geographic route, and because, before the CIA's Highland program, it was effectively ungoverned ground. No South Vietnamese army unit operated there with sustained effectiveness. The Montagnard were left to navigate a war that both sides prosecuted through their homeland without consulting them about it. The Raid of Darlac Province. The specific tribal group Petersen would work with most closely lived in longhouses constructed on stilts above the ground, organized their society matrilineally in a culture where women held property and determined kinship, and conducted their ceremonial life through a complex system of animal sacrifice. Communal drinking from clay jars of rice wine through long bamboo straws, and exchanges of brass armbands that encoded social obligation and honor in durable material form. The brass armbands were not decoration. They were a record of relationships, of obligations incurred and met, of the specific history of trust between the wearer and the people who had given them. A man with many armbands was a man whose word had been good across many exchanges, across many years in circumstances where keeping your word had cost something. Petersen would eventually leave the highlands wearing dozens of them from wrist to elbow. He had earned them one at a time. He had also been given a name. The raid named the second operational base of the Truong Son force Dam San, and they explained why. Dam San was the name of a legendary raid warrior, a figure from the tribal oral tradition who was victorious in all his battles, whom no enemy could conquer except the spirit of the sun itself. They gave the name to a base, and then, more significantly, they gave it to the man. Barry Petersen, the Australian captain from Mackay, Queensland, who had arrived in the highlands with bags of CIA cash and a vague operational brief, became Dam San in the raid's understanding of who he was. That naming was not ceremonial. In Raud culture, it was a formal declaration of what a man had demonstrated himself to be. What Petersen had demonstrated in the 2 years between his arrival in August of 1963 and his forced departure in 1965 was a form of commitment that the raid had no prior experience of from any outside military force. He learned their language, not a working vocabulary for operational communication, but the raid language itself, with its tonal complexity and its encoded history, the language in which the stories that mattered were told, and in which trust, when it was offered, was offered. He attended their ceremonies and participated in their ritual life, drinking the rice wine and accepting the obligations that drinking it together signified. He wore their clothing on operations, not as a gesture of cultural sensitivity, but because wearing it was a statement, made daily and in public, about whose side he was on. He paid his fighters. They were paid, willing volunteers in an environment where every other military force operating in the highlands had pressed Montagnard men into service through conscription, coercion, or the threat of violence. The distinction sounds administrative. In a counterinsurgency whose central problem was the population's unwillingness to commit irrevocably to either side, a man who fought because he had chosen to was worth 10 who fought because they had been compelled to. And every raid who watched Petersen pay his men on time, every time, understood the specific promise that payment represented. This force will not abandon you when it becomes inconvenient to keep you. Within 12 months of his arrival at Ban Mi Thuot, operating virtually alone in the mountains with supply coming in on Air America, flights that landed and departed without paperwork or witnesses, Petersen had recruited and was training more than 1,000 Montagnard fighters. By 1965, the Truong Son force, named after the mountain range that the highlands contained, numbered 1,200 men, organized across multiple bases in Darlac province, with an operational fund of 5 million Vietnamese piastres drawn from CIA accounts that Petersen managed with the specific accountability of a man who understood that being trusted with money was a test of everything else he claimed to be. He established a training regimen of 6 to 8 weeks that took men who knew the mountains since childhood and layered onto that knowledge the specific tactical disciplines movement technique, silence, observation, ambush geometry that the Malayan emergency had refined over 12 years of testing them against an enemy who was also good at this kind of war. He had tiger head beret badges made, a deliberate act of identity creation that gave fighters from different tribal groups a shared visual marker, a symbol that said, before any operation began, "We are the same thing, and the enemy knows what that thing is." The Viet Cong gave them their name. The name Tiger Men in Vietnamese, the association with the striped camouflage pattern the CIA had supplied, and that Petersen had deliberately amplified through the beret badges spread through communist intelligence reporting about the force operating in Darlak province. It was not a name the enemy had chosen as a compliment. It was a name born from experience. From the experience of losing supply parties in the highlands to contacts that came from positions no advanced scout had identified. From the experience of columns that disappeared into the jungle and were found later, scattered, with no clear account of what had happened to them. To understand what disrupting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the Central Highlands actually meant in operational terms, it is necessary to understand what the trail was and what moving through it required. The trail was not a road. It was a network hundreds of kilometers of jungle paths, river crossings, way stations, supply caches, and rest points that had been developed over years by communist logisticians who understood the terrain with the familiarity of people who had been using it since before the war began. The trail through the highlands ran through Montagnard territory, because that territory was the most direct geographic route between the North and the communist forces operating in the provinces of the South, and because, before Petersen, it was effectively uncontested. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese logistics personnel moving through the highlands had done so in conditions that, while never comfortable, were predictable. They knew which paths were safe. They knew where the South Vietnamese army did and did not operate. They knew that the highland tribes, whatever their feelings about the communists, had no organized military capability that represented a serious interdiction threat. They had built their supply system around these knowns. What Petersen's force introduced was the specific quality of unpredictability that converts the familiar into the lethal. The Truong Son force's fighters were raid. They had walked these mountains since childhood, in the particular intimate way that people know land they have depended on for survival across generations, knowing which paths flooded after rain, and which stayed passable, which ridgelines offered observation without exposing the observer, which creek crossings were audible to the listening ear, and which were not. When Petersen taught them the specific disciplines of silence that the Malayan emergency had developed moving at the pace the terrain demanded, rather than the pace the mission's urgency suggested, stopping to listen before each advance, communicating through hand signals and eye contact rather than speech, taking positions that use the ground's natural concealment rather than constructed fighting positions that could be identified. He was combining their knowledge of the environment with a tactical methodology the communist forces had never encountered from a highland-based opponent. The result was a force that the enemy could not adequately scout because it moved the way the jungle moved, without announcing itself. In one documented operation, Charlie Company of the Truong Son force tracked a Viet Cong column of 120 men for 15 kilometers through dense jungle without being detected. 15 kilometers of following a large armed force through the mountain terrain of Darlak province at the pace the terrain imposed rather than the pace urgency demanded, close enough to observe but not close enough to be heard. At the end of that distance, the company had a complete picture of the enemy's strength, equipment, route, and pattern. The contact that followed scattered the column and prevented it from reorganizing. The Truong Son force sustained no casualties. The specific capability that operation demonstrated following a substantial enemy force through its own environment without being detected was not something Petersen had produced through a training program. It was something he had transmitted through the culture he had built across 2 years of shared presence. The understanding, held collectively and practiced daily, that silence was an operational asset as valuable as firepower, that patience in movement was not slowness but precision, and that the jungle belonged to the force that treated it as home rather than obstacle. The Viet Cong's response to the Truong Son force's operational effectiveness was, in its own way, the most precise measure the war produced of what Petersen had actually built. They placed a bounty on his head. The existence of a specific price on a specific Australian captain's life, operating in the mountains of Darlak province in a war Australia had not yet officially declared itself party to, is simultaneously absurd and completely logical. The bounty was strategic, not personal. The communist commanders who authorized it had correctly analyzed the Truong Son force's structure and identified its critical vulnerability. The force's effectiveness was inseparable from the individual who had built it. Remove Petersen, and the thing he had created would begin to dissolve, because the thing he had created was, at its foundation, a relationship between him and the raid that no replacement could inherit by appointment. The communist analysis was accurate. That accuracy would be confirmed in detail when the CIA eventually achieved what the Viet Cong bounty had not. They also learned something about his territory. The highlands have no shortage of jungle routes. The Viet Cong and NVA logistics personnel had used most of them for years without serious interference. What Petersen's force imposed was the specific uncertainty that makes route selection unreliable as a security measure. A path that had been used 100 times without incident could not be trusted to be safe on the 101st use, because it might have been under observation for 3 days. The watchers invisible against the vegetation in the specific way that raid fighters who had grown up in that terrain could become invisible. That uncertainty, the operational awareness that movement through Petersen's territory meant moving inside someone else's observation, that something you would not see until it was already happening might be watching you from ground. You had passed 100 times before, forced the enemy to route around his area entirely. Longer paths, higher ground, greater time, greater logistics difficulty, greater exposure to American air power on the more exposed routes. All of it accepted because the alternative was crossing Darlak province when the Tiger men were in it. The intelligence cycle this produced fed itself in the way that effective intelligence operations always do when the foundation is right. The Truong Son force's patrols generated information about Viet Cong movement patterns, timing, and route preferences. That information enabled more precisely positioned ambushes, which generated additional intelligence through captured documents and, occasionally, prisoners. The prisoners yielded route information that refined the patrol patterns, which improved the targeting, which generated more intelligence. Within 2 years of Petersen's arrival in the highlands, the CIA's operational assessment was registering what the force had achieved in the language of bureaucratic understatement. best combat records, heavy casualties, minimum friendly losses. What the assessment did not address, what it perhaps could not address without acknowledging something the agency did not wish to acknowledge, was that the force's effectiveness was not institutional, it was personal. And personal effectiveness, unlike institutional effectiveness, cannot be transferred by administrative decision. The problem was not military. The military results were exceptional by any measure the war provided. The problem was political, which in the CIA's operational framework meant, practically speaking, the same thing as uncontrollable. Petersen had not merely trained the Montagnard. He had built a relationship with them that his CIA handlers now described in their internal documentation as a personality cult, a phrase that said more about the anxiety it expressed than the reality it described. What Petersen had done was not create a cult. He had done what the Malayan emergency had taught him to do: built genuine trust with a local population in an environment where genuine trust was the most valuable and the scarcest operational resource. The CIA's handlers called him Lawrence of the Highlands. The comparison to T.E. Lawrence was not offered as praise. It was offered as a diagnosis of the specific failure mode they believed they were observing. The foreign officer who goes native, who becomes more loyal to the people he leads than to the organization that sent him there, whose decisions therefore cannot be reliably predicted or controlled from the outside. The anxiety was not entirely unreasonable as an institutional concern. Petersen had, in fact, become exactly what 20 years of Australian military culture had prepared him to become in this environment. The person the raid trusted most in a war where trust was not abundant. That trust made him irreplaceable to the Montagnard. It also made him a problem for everyone who needed to manage the situation from outside the mountains, because you cannot manage what you do not understand. And the CIA did not understand what Petersen had built, because what he had built was not a program. It was a relationship. The Montagnard had deeper grievances than the immediate war provided occasion to express. For 2 centuries, Vietnamese expansion had been compressing the highland tribes into an increasingly untenable position. Keen settlers moving steadily into highland territory, taking land, displacing communities, treating the indigenous population with a contempt that neither the communist North nor the nationalist South had any particular interest in addressing. The Montagnard hated the Viet Cong because the communist program offered them no autonomy and treated their territory as a transit corridor. They resented the South Vietnamese government because it treated their land as a colonial possession to be administered, rather than a homeland to be respected. They tolerated the Americans because the Americans had weapons and money and were willing to use both against enemies the Montagnard also had. They trusted Petersen because he had earned it through 2 years of demonstrated commitment that was not contingent on strategic utility. He had been there when there was no particular reason to be there except the work itself, and that consistency was the only currency that the raid relationship system recognized as legitimate. In September of 1964, the accumulated resentments of the Montagnard tribal groups toward the South Vietnamese government produced the crisis that had been building for years. A large-scale revolt began Montagnard fighters, including elements of forces armed and trained under the CIA's Highland program, rose against South Vietnamese military installations across several highland provinces. The movement had a name: FULRO, the Front Uni de Lutte des Races Opprimées, the United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races. It was not a spontaneous eruption. It was an organized political movement that had been building underground while the surface of the CIA's Highland program appeared stable, drawing on 2 centuries of Montagnard grievance against Vietnamese settlement and 2 decades of broken promises from successive outside powers that had armed and organized the tribal groups and then treated their political aspirations as inconvenient complications. Several hundred Montagnard fighters occupied a South Vietnamese military camp at Ban Me Thuot in the early morning hours of the 20th of September, 1964. They took South Vietnamese soldiers hostage. Similar actions occurred at camps in Buon Brieng and Ban Don. The South Vietnamese government's immediate response was predictable and, from the perspective of the counterinsurgency effort, almost perfectly calibrated to make the situation irreversible. They threatened military force. American Special Forces advisors at the affected camps were caught between the Montagnard fighters, who trusted them personally, and the South Vietnamese government that was their official principal. The situation had the specific character of crises that produce catastrophe when they are managed by institutional reflex rather than by human judgment. Petersen was not at Ban Me Thuot when the revolt began. He was in the field. When he received word of what had happened, his calculation was immediate, and its logic was the logic of the relationship he had built, rather than the logic of any institutional framework. The Montagnard fighters who had armed themselves and taken hostages were not his enemies. They were men whose political aspirations he understood, whose grievances he had watched accumulate across 2 years of close observation, and whose trust he had earned through the specific methods the emergency had taught him. Going into the rebel camp unarmed was dangerous in the obvious sense that an armed and politically agitated force in an occupied military installation is dangerous to anyone who enters it without leverage. It was also, in a different register, the only thing that could work. A man with a weapon was a negotiator. A man without one was something else. He was a person who had decided that the relationship was worth more than the safety the weapon provided. He walked in. He spoke in raid. He spoke as Dam San, as the man whose word had been tested across enough operations in the mountains that the fighters he was addressing had a basis for deciding whether to believe it or not. He offered them what he could offer: his presence as a guarantor, his word as a channel to the American advisors, and, through them, to the South Vietnamese authorities, and his judgment that the path the revolt was opening led somewhere no one in that camp actually wanted to go. He did not lecture them. He did not issue ultimatums. He negotiated as the Malayan emergency had taught him to negotiate. From inside the relationship rather than above it, from the position of someone who had something to lose in the outcome rather than someone who was managing a problem from a position of institutional distance. The revolt was diffused. The timing was not immediate. Negotiations of this kind are not immediate, and the military cross citation's language about heightened sensitivity and high degree of personal risk is a careful understatement of how many hours Petersen spent inside that camp, unarmed, while the situation remained unresolved. But it was diffused. The hostages were released. The South Vietnamese military response that would have turned a political crisis into a military one was forestalled. The FULRO uprising was eventually suppressed by American forces, and the political aspirations it had expressed were not addressed, and the underlying condition that had produced it continued to deteriorate. But the immediate catastrophe, the destruction of the CIA's Highland program by its own trained force, the transformation of the most effective anti-communist guerrilla capability in the mountains into an active enemy of the counterinsurgency was prevented. The Military Cross was awarded for that action. Petersen also received the South Vietnam Cross of Gallantry with Silver Star for the broader conduct of the Truong Son force operation. The military cross citation described the conditions as involving heightened sensitivity and a high degree of personal risk, which is the British honor system's careful language for a situation in which a man walked unarmed into an armed camp and talked people out of a war. What the citation could not convey, and what the official record of the action does not capture, is the specific quality of what Petersen had built that made the action possible at all. The years of accumulated trust that meant the fighters inside that camp had a reason to listen to him that they would have had for no other person, the CIA, the South Vietnamese government, or the Australian Army could have sent through that gate. The CIA's response to this episode revealed the gap between operational logic and institutional logic that would ultimately determine Petersen's fate. He had just demonstrated in the most direct and unambiguous possible way that his relationship with the raid was the single most valuable asset the Highland program possessed, that his authority with the tribes exceeded anything the CIA, the South Vietnamese government, or the American military advisory system could produce through any alternative mechanism. The rational response, from any analysis that prioritized mission effectiveness, would have been to recognize that asset explicitly and invest in protecting it. The CIA instead read the episode as confirmation of the concern they had already expressed. An Australian captain who could walk unarmed into a rebel camp and end a revolt by speaking in a tribal language he had learned on his own time was precisely the kind of unmanageable asset that institutional risk frameworks existed to eliminate. The ultimatum was delivered through his CIA handler. The language was direct. Leave the highlands voluntarily or leave in a body bag. An informant reached Petersen separately with a more specific version of the same message that CIA operatives had developed a plan to kill him and make his death appear accidental, allowing him to leave as a hero rather than as a problem that required explaining. He would learn the specifics of this plan only years after the fact, from sources whose reliability he had no reason to doubt. At the time, he received the official order, not the CIA ultimatum, but the formal order from within his own Australian chain of command, and he obeyed it. He had spent 2 years in the Highlands building something for which there was no official category, and he was not going to disobey a direct order from the Australian Army to preserve it. He was, in the end, an Australian soldier. The discipline of obedience was as fundamental to what he was as the discipline of patience. The farewell the Montagnard gave him was the kind of ceremony reserved for men of the very highest standing. He sat on a bamboo mat, dressed in full tribal regalia, traditional raid clothing, dozens of brass armbands covering his arms from wrist to elbow, each one a record of a relationship honored, an obligation met, a piece of trust built across specific operations in specific circumstances. The tribes had brought food and rice wine. There were gifts, received as a chief receives them, with the formality that raid ceremony required. The camp the Montagnard had named Dam San was full. The photograph that the Australian War Memorial holds in its collection catalogue reference C309397 shows a young Australian captain sitting in the mountains of Vietnam in Montagnard tribal dress, surrounded by men who would follow him back into the jungle on his word and who were watching him leave on an order. His CIA handlers looked at the same photograph and said it confirmed what they had always believed. He had gone native. They were describing the same evidence and reaching the only conclusion their institutional framework allowed them to reach. The American CIA operative who replaced Petersen in Ban Me Thuot did not build the same relationship with the raid. This was not a personal failing on the replacement's part. It was a structural impossibility. The trust Petersen had built across 2 years of shared language, shared risk, shared ceremony, and shared daily life in the highlands was not transferable by administrative appointment. It was not the product of a position or a rank or an operational brief. It was the product of a specific individual whose entire professional formation, from Kanungra through the Malayan emergency, through 2 years on the ground in Darlak province, had prepared him to earn it. The CIA had removed the irreplaceable element and substituted a replaceable one, and the Highland program's effectiveness declined in precisely the way that anyone who understood what had produced that effectiveness would have predicted. The Viet Cong stopped routing around Petersen's territory when he was gone because there was no longer any particular reason to route around it. The routes through Darlak province that had gone unused while the Tiger men were active resumed their function as Ho Chi Minh Trail logistics arteries. The Highland program continued for several more years, increasingly Americanized, increasingly reliant on material resources to compensate for the relationship depth it no longer possessed, producing results that the assessments continued to describe favorably and that the operational reality supported less and less convincingly. The Montagnard who had built the Truong Son force continued to serve, with decreasing effectiveness and increasing disillusionment, through the long, slow erosion of the counterinsurgency effort that the American escalation of conventional operations simultaneously accelerated and obscured. Petersen's own career continued. He completed a second tour in Vietnam as a major, was mentioned in dispatches for bravery, and was told at some point the precise occasion is not documented, but the substance of the communication is consistent across multiple independent accounts that his future promotion path within the Australian Army was limited. The Army did not know quite how to categorize an officer who had spent 2 years building a private army in the mountains for the CIA, who had been awarded 13 medals across Vietnam, Borneo, and Malaysia, who had been simultaneously the most effective paramilitary commander the Highland program had produced, and the most significant institutional problem the CIA had encountered in that program. He was too effective to dismiss and too irregular to fully accommodate. He retired as a lieutenant colonel. By the Army's formal standards, that was a respectable career. Against the standard of what he had actually accomplished, it was a quiet administrative verdict on the problem of excellence that cannot be replicated within institutional structures. The Montagnard who had built the Truong Son force did not receive any verdict at all. They served through the rest of the war with decreasing effectiveness as the CIA's Highland program was progressively Americanized, and the specific relational foundation that Petersen had built was replaced by material inputs, more weapons, more money, more American Special Forces advisors that addressed everything about the program's structure, except the element that had made it work. The FULRO movement continued to operate underground, suppressed but not dissolved, through the remainder of the war. When Saigon fell in April of 1975 and the North Vietnamese completed their military victory, the consequences for the Montagnard were severe and immediate. The communist government that took control of unified Vietnam had a long memory for the Highland tribes that had served the CYA's program, and no particular interest in the distinction between forced service and voluntary commitment. The re-education camps that processed much of the South's former military population were supplemented, for the Montagnard, by policies of deliberate cultural suppression and accelerated resettlement that continued the displacement process the war itself had interrupted. Some of Petersen's former fighters fled across the border into Cambodia, where the Khmer Rouge created conditions that were, improbably, even more dangerous than the ones they had left. Others remained in the highlands, navigating the post-war period with the specific resilience of people who had been navigating hostile administrations since long before the Americans arrived. The FULRO movement maintained an armed resistance in the highlands that lasted, in diminishing form, until the early 1990s, long after the war that had given it its immediate context had ended and been processed by the outside world into history. For the Montagnard, the war did not end in April of 1975. It simply changed administrators. Petersen settled in Bangkok. He worked with Montagnard refugees who had made it out through Thailand, through camps along the Thai-Cambodian border, through the specific geography of displacement that the post-war regional order created. He helped where he could, using the networks he had maintained and the relationships that no amount of time had dissolved, operating in the careful margins where a former CIA contracted Australian officer could provide assistance without drawing the attention of governments that would have found his continued involvement inconvenient. He never spoke of this work publicly in the way that men who want credit for their good deeds speak of them. He regarded it as an obligation that the relationship required, not a deed that deserved recognition. Decades after his departure from Darlak province, he returned to the highlands, traveling as a writer, his true identity concealed from the Vietnamese security services, who would have had compelling operational interest in identifying a man who had spent 2 years systematically disrupting the Ho Chi Minh Trail from inside their own territory. He found former fighters from the Truong Son force, men who had been young when he knew them, who were now old, and who had survived decades of exactly the kind of suppression that communist governments apply to populations that chose the wrong side. He tried to maintain distance, to observe without announcing himself. Some of his former fighters, recognizing him despite the years, nearly gave him away by shaking and kissing his hands, the raid gesture of deepest respect, reserved for men of the standing that the brass armbands encoded. He was still, to them, Dam San. He died in Bangkok in February of 2019, of cancer. He was 84 years old. The announcement of his death ran in the Asia Times under the headline that captured the essential fact of his career without requiring explanation. The Tiger Man of Vietnam. He had 13 medals. He had a reputation that the CIA would have preferred to manage more quietly. And he had a legacy recorded not in his country's official military history, not in the volumes that cataloged the AATTV's decorations and operations and formal achievements, but in the memory of 1,200 Montagnard fighters and their descendants. In the photograph at the Australian War Memorial of a young man in brass armbands sitting on a bamboo mat in the mountains of Darlak province, and in the CIA assessment that described one of the best combat records in Vietnam in the language of bureaucratic evaluation, with no acknowledgement of what it had cost to produce it or what it had cost to end it. Former Governor-General of Australia, Major General Mike Jeffrey, who had himself commanded the SAS, said of Petersen, in an interview conducted in 2002, Barry Petersen was one of the very best of the Australian military profession because he took on such a difficult and unique task. The assessment is accurate and insufficient simultaneously. What Jeffrey was describing was not a difficult and unique task successfully completed. It was the outer limit of what the specific military culture that Australia had built across 20 years of hard operational experience could produce when it found the right individual to carry it to its conclusion, Ikwa Bayao, soldier so completely formed by that culture's deepest lessons and so completely committed to its core principles that he took them further than the institutions supporting him could comfortably follow, built something that the enemy placed a price on, and the CIA found threatening, and left it behind when ordered to, because the discipline of obedience was, in the end, as fundamental to what he was as the discipline of patience that had built it. The story of what Barry Petersen built in the central highlands of Vietnam between 1963 and 1965 is not finally a story about tactics or intelligence or counterinsurgency doctrine. It is a story about a specific quality of human commitment, the kind that crosses the distance between one culture and another completely, not as a professional exercise, but as a personal decision repeated daily across 2 years of shared risk and shared ceremony and shared language, until the distance collapses and what is left is not a foreign officer managing an indigenous force, but a man who belongs to the people he leads and is understood by them to belong. But to understand why Petersen could do what he did and why the Americans who replaced him could not replicate it, you need to understand the structural difference between the two military systems that the Vietnam War brought into contact in the same theater. The American military's approach to the Vietnam War was, at its foundation, an industrial approach. It processed soldiers through the war on 12-month rotations. A private who arrived in January would leave the following January, regardless of what he had learned, regardless of the relationships he had built, regardless of the intelligence networks he had cultivated or the trust he had established with the populations his unit operated alongside. The rotation system served institutional purposes. It distributed combat experience broadly across the officer corps. It prevented the development of unit cohesion that might complicate command relationships. It maintained the fiction that every soldier's Vietnam was equally dangerous and equally valuable as preparation for the career that came after. What it destroyed was the specific form of expertise that counterinsurgency requires. The expertise that is not procedural but relational, not teachable in a classroom, but accumulated through months of sustained presence with specific people in a specific environment. General William Westmoreland complained to the Australian commander, Major General Tim Vincent, that the Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy province were not being aggressive enough. The complaint revealed, with considerable precision, the gap between the American doctrine and the Australian one. Westmoreland measured aggression in operations initiated, in bodies counted, in ground covered. The Australian doctrine measured it differently, in population secured, in intelligence gathered, in enemy options foreclosed. The body count was held in explicit contempt by many Australian battalion commanders, not because they were unwilling to fight, but because they understood that killing the enemy at the cost of alienating the population was not winning a counterinsurgency. It was harvesting it. You could count the harvest for years and still lose the war at the end of it, because the war was not about who killed more. It was about who the population decided to protect. The Australians in Phuoc Tuy province, the 1st Australian Task Force operating from Nui Dat, applied this understanding through methods that American commanders watching them found frustratingly slow. Patrols that took 9 hours to cover a mile of terrain, moving a few steps at a time, stopping to listen before proceeding, picking their way through bamboo thickets and tangled vegetation, along routes that avoided the jungle tracks the enemy had mined and the clearings where ambushes waited. A journalist covering Australian operations during the war observed in print that it was a frustrating experience to trek through the jungle with Australians. He was describing the precise quality that made them effective. The frustration was the capability. The slowness was the silence. The silence was what allowed a 5-man patrol to spend a week in enemy-controlled territory, gathering intelligence, without the enemy knowing it was there. Petersen applied the same logic in the highlands, but carried it further than the task force's conventional patrols could go, because the force he was building was not a patrol force. It was an indigenous guerrilla army whose members already belonged to the environment in the deepest possible sense they had been born in it, had learned to read it as children, and brought to their military service an environmental intimacy that no amount of training in Kanungra could produce in someone who had not grown up in that specific terrain. What Petersen gave them was the tactical framework to convert that intimacy into systematic operational advantage. What they gave him, in return, was access to a quality of ground truth about routes, about enemy patterns, about the specific texture of the highland terrain across every season and every weather condition that no intelligence collection system the CIA possessed could have generated from the outside. The Americans who worked alongside Petersen's force understood this in the specific way that professionals understand things they cannot replicate. The United States Army's Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol School at Nha Trang, where Australian SAS instructors from Phuoc Tuy Province taught the techniques of deep jungle patrol operations, was one formal acknowledgement of what the Australian military system had produced. The CIA's decision to seek out an AATTV officer specifically for the Highlands assignment was another. What the Americans found consistently difficult to produce across multiple programs and multiple years of trying was the quality that the Australian system built into its officers before they arrived in Vietnam. The understanding that the soldier who belongs to the environment fights a different war than the soldier who is visiting it, and that the process of belonging cannot be accelerated by commitment or resources or doctrine. It requires time and the willingness to spend that time in ways that produce no visible output until suddenly everything depends on the investment having been made. The Viet Cong who placed a bounty on Petersen's head understood something that the CIA's operational assessment did not fully process until he was gone. That the force they had learned to fear in the highlands of Darlak province was not 1,200 armed Montagnard tribesmen. It was one Australian captain and the specific quality of presence he carried into the mountains with him. The raid fighters were the body of it. Petersen was its animating principle. You could not kill the one without losing the other, and you could not remove the other without watching the one slowly cease to be what it had been. The bounty was, in its own way, the most accurate strategic assessment any party to the operation ever produced of where the actual capability resided. The Viet Cong knew what was dangerous. They knew that if the man disappeared, the mountains would eventually stop being what they had been while he was in them. They were right. And in being right, they identified the precise quality of leadership that no doctrine document, no training program, no institutional assessment in the history of the war ever quite managed to name in clean language the quality of a soldier who had made himself so completely a part of the environment and the people in it that removing him was not a management decision. It was an amputation. The CIA made that amputation, and the Highland program bled out slowly over the years that followed, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail resumed its function through the mountains that the Tiger Men had made impassable while their commander was among them. You will never see them coming is what the enemy learned about moving through Darlak province when Barry Petersen was in the highlands. It stopped being true the moment he left. That is the complete account of what one man's presence is worth and what one institution's decision to remove him cost, and why the title of this script names something that was not merely a tactical quality of the Truong Son force, but the specific human achievement of the soldier who built it. A soldier who had so completely closed the distance between himself and the environment he fought in that the enemy could not distinguish in the dark of the Darlak Highlands, where the jungle ended and the threat began. Tell me in the comments whether you think what Barry Petersen built in the highlands of Vietnam could have been preserved if the CIA and the Australian Army had let him stay, and if you want more military history that refuses to simplify what actually happened, subscribe now.